morning, everyone. Thank you for your patience. My name's Diana Svitan, and I'm Director of Global Learning and Partnerships here at Fairleigh Dickinson University. And I'd like to welcome you to our installment of the UN Pathways video lecture series. Today's topic is the Syrian refugee situation. And personally, I can point to my experience looking and viewing the occurrences with shock in Syria, and really a sense of heartbreak seeing the streams of people headed towards Europe. But I think that most of us also look at this situation and don't fully understand who is displaced in this situation and the full impact. So we are fortunate today to have our host, Ambassador Kamal, guide us with our guest speaker, Mr. Richard Wright, who will give us a fuller understanding of the Syrian refugee situation. And I'll turn it over to Ambassador Kamal.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you, all of you, of Fairleigh Dickinson University in its different incarnations. In the United States and Canada, plus of course Bronx and Lock Haven and Long Island University. It's a pleasure because Mr. Richard Wright, Mr. Wright is the head of the United Nations Refugee Relief and Welfare Organization, which takes care of all the problems of Palestine and Israel, which, as you all know, is a problem that has been going on for, they say, 60 years. I think it is 260 years already, and likely to be another 260 years into the future. So this, Mr. Wright is truly the ranking expert on the subject of refugees and displaced persons. With his permission and with yours, let me lead into the subject myself. We are officially supposed to be discussing Syrian refugees, but that is not quite correct, because what is described as Syrian refugees in the press are refugees not just from Syria, but also from Iraq, also from Afghanistan, Pakistan, a lot from Chad and Niger in Africa coming through Libya. So there is a huge movement of refugees throughout the larger Middle East, basically, officially at least, towards the European Union. But even that is not correct. It is not only a problem of movement towards the European Union, because many of these refugees are also from other parts of the world. For example, in Southeast Asia, in Myanmar, you have the Rohingyas who are being due to the deliberate policies of the government of Myanmar, and who are trying to leave and have gone as far across the seas as into Australia. So the problem is wider than that of the Syrian refugees. But it's an unbelievable problem, because suddenly, out of the blue, you have these extraordinary numbers of people who are moving out of their homes and trying to cross deserts and seas in order to get havens in other developed areas. Among them are lots of women and children. And that is one of the surprising things, because, as you know from the press, a large number of women and children have died either by heat or by drowning in the Mediterranean on their path towards safer havens. So the real question then we have to discuss is that there is supposed to be something called humanitarian law. And in humanitarian law, there was a principle which I thought was an accepted principle, which is, unfortunately, can only be described in its French terminology, because it does not have an English word for it. And that principle is called non-refoulement. In other words, you cannot push back somebody who is a refugee or a displaced person who's trying to enter your country. You cannot push back under humanitarian law. And yet, we have been pushing them back deliberately over time, everywhere. The United States pushed back the boat people from Cuba and other places. The Australians pushed back the Rohingyas and the Afghans who were trying to enter Australia. And so the European Union, as we all know, is pushing back those who tried to enter the European Union. And so this principle, the basic principle of non-refoulement, which is that a person in need has to be helped and not to be pushed back, is being questioned and deliberately contravened by everybody. And then we have a second problem in humanitarian law, which is that there is an arbitrary definition for what is called a refugee, as opposed to what is called a migrant, as opposed to what is called an internally displaced person. And when I was the president or the chairman of the High Commission for Refugees, I tried to argue that this was an unfair definition, because anybody who has to leave his home for whatever reason would have considered as a refugee. But the official definition is that you have to leave your home and cross a border in order to be a refugee. And after that, there is again a definition that you must be forced to leave for political reasons. And if you're leaving for economic reasons, then you're only an economic migrant. Now, most of us do not accept these definitions, which are really Eurocentric definitions, because they do not meet the principles of simple humanitarian. But coming back to Syria, the question in Syria is, these are very large number of what are described as the Syrian refugees. Why has this problem started? Why is it that it is only 4 years ago that suddenly Syria became a dirty country? Before that, the president of Syria, the current president of Syria, was an agent of the CIA of the United States, because the United States was sending him people from Guantanamo to be treated in Syria on behalf of the United States. Of the road was not possible because Syria has a close relationship with Iran, and therefore suddenly, having discovered that the road could not be cut, Syria became a bad country. And then the civil war started in Syria. There was no civil war until 4 years ago. What started it? Was it due to internal reasons, or was it due to external intervention in Syria, as we had seen years earlier in the Spanish Civil War? And so what has happened? So it was a huge area which has been constricted into what is Syria today as a result of the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 and the breakup of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. And so the question that I want to throw at Mr. Wright is, who is responsible for what is happening in Syria? Is it internal, or is it external, or is it a mixture of the two? The floor is yours, sir.
The Palestine refugee community in Syria, which was about 500,000 people, about 550,000 people before the current conflict started, were actually probably better off and better treated there than they are in other parts, in Gaza, for example, or the West Bank, in Lebanon. And actually, the community there had certain rights. Many of them were able to important conventions and bodies of law to be respected. Now, all this has led the Secretary General of the United Nations to convene a summit on the need to support humanitarian work. It's called the World Humanitarian Summit. It will take place in Istanbul next month. And this is possible solution is a political solution, and this is why an effort is underway in Geneva under the responsibility of the Secretary General's Special Envoy, Mr. de Mistura, a very eminent Swedish-Italian diplomat, to try and find a political solution in an extremely difficult environment. And he renews his the efforts are currently. He will begin again with the parties next week, but it's extremely difficult process. But he does have the support this time of the Security Council backing him. So I mean, this is just in a nutshell some of the challenges in Syria, which is without any question front and center of the United Nations today. It's reflected in the huge effort that all UN much are making in the field to try and address some of the terrible consequences of conflict. But it's also, as I said, throwing up really fundamental questions about the sustainability of the existing humanitarian system. It is simply cannot go on in the current way, form. It is broke, not broken, as is sort of very timely from the point of view of humanitarianism, if I put it like that. The Secretary General has set out his agenda for humanity, for how he wants to see the humanitarian system come together and to respond to some of these challenges. But it's also, I think, relevant in the context of the other key UN work recently, the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. One of the key principles is that no one is left behind. Well, today a lot of people are getting in because of all the things that I've described and Ambassador Kamal has described. So it's a hugely challenging moment for the United Nations, and we hope that the results of this year's efforts by the initiatives called by the Secretary General will hope to make the system better and, above all, to solve some of these terrible conflicts.
Thank you very much, sir. My problem is that I do not share your optimism at all. You're going to have a conference. The solution found so far is to push back people and say, go back. That's not a solution. That is the total opposite of all that humanitarian law has been working on for 60 years. And so, and as for finances, everybody has a budgetary problem these days. So money is in short supply. And without that, you're not going to get anywhere. Instability will grow, and the current map of the Middle East will not survive years. For me, 5 years is the maximum in which you can have the current map of the world with nice colors and different borders. None of this is going to work. And so the problem and the magnitude of the problem, when I chaired the High Commission for Refugees, which was about 20 years ago, we had 16 million refugees and 8 million internally displaced persons. Today, that figure of 24 or so has gone times. Officially, they say 60 million refugees, and you have now raised that figure, doubled it to 120 million of those who need assistance. So I see the problem. I see the growing problem. I see the danger of instability as a result of the problem. I don't see a solution. And so you, Mr. Wright, you are the ranking person. You've been dealing with this for, as I said, 250 years. How can you go to sleep? How do you sleep knowing that there is no solution and that in the morning the problem will be even more serious? How do you sleep? That is my question to you.
Well, Ambassador Kamal is, I wouldn't want you to think that he's being provocative here. Well, first of all, I with all due respect to him, let me repeat again that, my work is not politically orientated. It's not, UNRWA is an agency deal with humanitarian situation which the world is now confronted with. These are the consequences of political failure, let's be clear, whether it's Israel, Palestine, whether it's Syria, or whether it's Somalia, Sudan, etc., etc. Political failure, conflict, but also, let's not forget, also natural disasters can result effects of climate change. These also humanitarian effects. But I think I'm correct in saying that about 80% of the people who need humanitarian assistance today need it because of man-made conflicts. Look, and the only solution to conflicts are political solutions. Humanitarian work cannot be a substitute for political solutions. And indeed, I think, I think there's quite clear because of political failure, there's a risk. There's always a risk that humanitarian work becomes instrumentalized or becomes, if you like, the solution to the problem, perceived solution to a problem, when it isn't at all. For example, in Syria, one of the most egregious and disturbing aspects of the conflict have been people living in besieged areas, whether the siege is being laid by the government or by armed groups or rebels. Breaking these sieges has taken an awful long time, and there's still huge challenges ahead, but there has been some modest progress in recent months. But it's not. I mean, we are the consequences of these sieges, and indeed, Palestine refugees near Damascus in the suburbs of Yarmouk that I referred to earlier. We have been able recently to begin supplying again some of these refugees in this situation, but for many, many months we were unable to do so. But this is a consequence of political decisions taken by the parties involved. The only solution, I don't sleep well at night, Ambassador, when I think about some of the terrible humanitarian consequences that are inflicted on people as a result of conflict. You're quite right to say that women and children are often the worst victims of this violence, and civilians in general. But there is no alternative to political solutions. What the current efforts of the Secretary General and making this year a year of sort of humanitarianism is the need to ensure that the humanitarian system is best equipped and best able to cope with the consequences that have arisen from conflict and indeed from natural disasters. And that in and of itself is a worthwhile thing to do, and there's a lot that can be done to make the system work better than it has already. But at the end of the day, if there are 35 conflicts in the world, political conflicts, they can only be situation can only be improved if political solutions are found. And the reality is that today that the average duration of displacement in a conflict is 17 years. 17 years. I mean, this is an enormous amount of time. My own agency, we're dealing with a displacement conflict that began in 1948-49. So we're talking about 67 years. So in a way, we're the outlier in the whole process. But the average worldwide is 17 years, which is still an incredible amount of time. And you have to ask yourself, what happens to these people during people who are displaced over a 17-year period? Who's going to look after them? Who's going to provide health services, education services, social services, and support to these people until they have a choice, hopefully again, to return from where they came? And this highlights one of the key issues that is being discussed this year in the Humanitarian Summit, which is that there are many more resources in the world in the development side of the equation. So, the support that is given to nations to develop and to build their countries, there's more there than for pure humanitarian assistance. And one of the efforts that is underway as a result of these initiatives by the Secretary General is to try and link up better the humanitarian and the development world, so that in cases where there are protracted refugee situations or displacement, that you can also draw in and use developmental resources to build schools, to build health centers, to provide infrastructure for people who are probably in all likelihood going to be displaced for far longer than should be the case.
For questions, we have 7 universities in front of us. We'll take 2 quick questions from each, and try to give 2 quick answers, starting with Bronx first and then Lockhaven. Bronx, you have the floor.
In what ways has the agency's educational mission to teach human rights, resolution, and tolerance in schools been fulfilled, and by what benchmarks has this progress been measured?
The second question. Does Bronx have a second question?
Yeah. Hello. My name is Robert Sowa, and my question is, in what ways does the Agency Advisory Commission work with the government and NGOs to strategize solutions to the Syrian refugee crisis, as well as long-term problems that are arising.
Okay, how important is education and what is the role of NGOs?
Look, education, it's a very good point. We have found, let me just talk from a point of view of our agency in Palestine Refugees. Education in many ways lies at the heart of our work. We have two arms in UNRWA. On the one hand, we provide this sort of developmental type services that I described a few minutes ago, health, education, relief and social services. On the other hand, unfortunately, we are obliged also to provide a very large amount of humanitarian assistance to refugees, for example, in Gaza, who were affected by the conflict in summer 2014, also those in Syria, and also, emergency services to refugees elsewhere. But one thing that I think that everyone has realized recently, particularly, is that in situations of conflict and in situations of displacement, it is really absolutely essential that people who are in this situation are provided with education services and health services, obviously, particularly if they're going to be just a long time. Now, as I said, the average duration of conflicts these days is 17 years. So if that is the case, then you are going to need education services and you're going to need health services. Now, my own agency is because we've been in the business, if you like, for so many years, 66 years, when conflicts arise in where we work, we're able to provide or to continue to provide education services because we're doing it already and we have the infrastructure. But what we've learned particularly recently is that when people in a desperate situation really, and young families with young children, they attach enormous importance to the maintenance of education for their children. And if this is taken away, this often is the last trigger, the last element that is in the decision of people to seek elsewhere, to leave the country, to move elsewhere within the country, or at worst to get on a boat run by a smuggler to try and get into Europe or elsewhere. So education is absolutely vital. And I've met myself many Palestine refugees when I visited them in the field, in Lebanon and in Syria, Jordan and elsewhere, that whereas the parents of the children, in ways because of their situations, don't have high expectations of what they can achieve or what they can do for themselves, they do care about what happens to their children. And if you take that away, then you're taking away a large part of their dignity, their hopes, and their desire to see a better life for themselves and their families. So this is a very key point. It's also it's obviously very important in and of itself because children have a right and human right to have an education, but it's also a key element in decisions on people whether to move and to become refugees.
Yeah, the problem, of course, is that when you are in the middle of a new refugee situation, or you are being pushed back, as the Europeans are pushing back the Syrians, it's not possible to set up education immediately. It takes time to set up an educational system. And so children suffer, and they suffer grievously because of this problem. On the question of NGOs, the refugee agencies are all small agencies. They don't have many personnel and they don't have much money. And so they are largely dependent on assistance from the non-governmental organizations for work in the field. And that is a critical input that all of them get from the NGOs.
If I can just add to that, Ambassador Kamal has described correctly the situation of many UN agencies, but it is not the case for our agency. And this this is one of the things that distinguishes us between.
Yes, but you have had 68 years to develop.
But we don't provide education services through NGOs or other bodies. We do it through our own staff. Yeah. We have 30 staff who are themselves Palestine refugees, and is actually one of the distinguishing features of UNRWA compared to, for example, UNHCR, the agency dealing with all the other refugees in the world, who deliver services mainly, but not exclusively, but mainly through NGOs or civil society or local partners. This is not a criticism or anything like that. It's just saying the structure is different, and it is one of the features of our agency. And it also helps to explain why, in situations of conflict, we're able to react very quickly, because we have the infrastructure already in place.
Okay, two questions from Lock Haven, followed by two from Long Island University in Brooklyn. To Lock Haven, over to you.
I know several people who fear that when highly developed countries like the US reach out to help other countries, really doing it only out of self-interest for resources and power. What do you say to those people?
Second question.
The second question stems from the recent conference I attended, where a student who was doing research sort of compared the acculturation process for refugees and migrants similar to what happens with veterans and PTSD. So maybe adding on to what you talked about that's trying to be provided for education, what about some of those social and psychological services that would maybe benefit in the acculturation process?
I'll take the first question, and Mr. Wright will take the second. I don't think it is fair to believe that self-interest defines the approach to refugees. I can tell you, for example, that Pakistan took in 3.5 million Afghan refugees, only with open door policy. There was no self-interest. It was very costly for Pakistan. Next door to us, Iran took in 2 million Afghan refugees, also for the same reason, no self-interest, but open door vis-a-vis refugees. The same is true for Syrian refugees in Jordan or in Lebanon or in Turkey. It's not because of any self-interest. So if the United States is going to place self-interest, I think they are a very key country to be able to use that as a reason. And probably it's a reason because they have the great advantage of 3,000 miles of water on both sides of the country. Over to you for this first.
Yeah, I mean, I would say just on that point, come to the second question. I mean, the United States is an extremely important funder of all UN agencies. In our case, about a quarter of our funding comes from the United States. I would say a very well-established tradition in the US to support refugees and humanitarian appeals. And often the US is the catalyst and the trigger to bring in other donors. So the US plays a hugely important role, and I think will certainly continue to do so in the future, and certainly is a key partner for us. Look, I mean, on other services, I think you're quite right. I mean, if I understood you correctly, the sort of services you need to provide to people in situations of conflict initially are pure humanitarian services in the sense of, food, water, sanitation, habitation, etc. But if in situations where this goes on longer than that, then you have to, and probably quite quickly, broaden it to include education, health. I mean, you were touching on, I think you said psychosocial services. Certainly, if I can speak from our experience, in Gaza in 2014, in the summer, there was a very destructive conflict between Israel and Palestinians in Gaza. The result of this was a huge loss of life. About 1,500 or so civilians killed, but a third of them were children, very tragically. But many children witnessed and destruction and loss of their friends and their parents and relations, etc. And they need psychosocial support. And not just immediately after the conflict. We are finding now, 18 months after the conflict, that more and more children need these type of services because of this sort of delayed reaction, this type of, in some ways this is sort of after post-traumatic stress, but there are many people who need this, and I'm sure this is also the situation where people are recovering natural disasters as well.
Over to Long Island in Brooklyn for 2 questions, followed by Long Island at Post.
Oh, hi. I was thinking that internationally, countries are required to take in certain number of refugees, but for some reason we have some countries refusing to take certain numbers of refugees. Why is that happening, and why can't we pressure developed countries to take in more refugees than other countries, like the nearby countries around Syria, like Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan, that don't have the resources and don't provide good services for the numbers they have?
Second question.
My question speaks to I see there is a grotesque disfigurement of the interpretation and implementation of the 1951 Refugees Convention, and it's 67, which is that rights have no bearing without those who have committed to uphold its tenets actually commit to upholding it. So it's like you can only be brave when a situation is there that you might be scared in. The only time that you can uphold rights is when rights are being threatened. So when you have deals that are struck between the EU and Turkey, or you have countries that are signed on to this practice, to this protocol, what would you say, what place is there to say, we have no money, we have no space, we have fear for our own domestic security? What space or room is there for those arguments to have any weight to them when you have this situation that requires you to stand by this protocol that you've committed to, yet in the face of a time when it's actually needed for you to put boots on the ground, to put action behind your words, you're going to fall back on them?
Great questions from Long Island, and these are central to the whole problem, because we have humanitarian law and we have a concept of helping your neighbor who is in need, and that's the spiritual law. So there is a spiritual law and a legal law, but both of them are being transgressed, because the argument is, I'm sorry, I don't care, I don't want you, go back, I refuse to let you come in. And so the fundamentals of law and spirit are being transgressed. 400 refugees wanted to get into Australia, which is the size of the United States, with a population of, 15 or 16 million only. And the Australians refused to allow 400 of them to come in, saying it will spoil the population structure of this country. I mean, how can you have this type of action being taken when somebody is in need? So, Mr. Wright, please hold out hope for us. Don't just depress us as you are doing all the time. Floor is yours.
Well, look, I mean, first of all, I think let's go back to Syria, and I think, one should recognize the massive efforts that have been taken by Syria's neighbors. Lebanon, I think it's up to 33% of its population is currently refugees, and remember they were hosting around 300,000 Palestinian refugees before the current conflict on top of that. Jordan, who also in the order of 1 million, and Turkey well over 2 million. So these countries are doing, and Germany also last year took in roughly was it 1 million or 1 million people. So, and there was certainly a lot of people in Europe. I used to work for the European Union, not in this area, but who were saying, the numbers in Europe. I think you were saying the same thing in global terms were very small. I would also add Sweden and Nordic countries who've also done a lot. But for all countries in the world, I mean, it has to be dealt with in a cooperative fashion. Now, I think it's absolutely essential. I agree with you that the existing body of law, refugee law, the 1951 Refugee Convention has to be upheld. Nobody, certainly in the UN, wants to see any rolling back of the obligations under it. But Having said that, there are there's huge challenges in implementation, which is, I think, the problem that everyone is now grappling with. But the bigger and most important question behind it all is, why are all these people in this sort of desperate situation? What is being done to address the underlying causes of the conflict? And that really is the key thing. And in all these situations, you cannot solve refugee situations or situations caused by conflict just by humanitarian approaches. It's not enough. You need, for the measures it's put in place now with Turkey, which are just now being implemented. We'll have to see what happens. But there is also, the other side is that they will take in a refugee who's been screened and whose legal processes are correct if people have to return. But it's a huge challenge. Let's not get around it.
Over to Long Island and Post, followed by Vancouver. Long Island.
Hi. With increased globalization and connectivity, even if you stop conflicts, how do you solve the problem of economic migrants who can't thrive in their own economies? Because I don't see anyone paying the reparations for what will be a destroyed economy in these places.
Second question, if any.
Yeah, hi. For our second question, I actually want to maybe press both of you to think optimistically, and it brings us back to what Mr. Wright was saying about the cost.
Also been always the key issue between the major powers. So the optimistic side of it is the parties are at least talking, albeit separately, that the two major powers are backing the effort. I would say there is some improvement on the ground in terms of the humanitarian situation. There has been a reduction in violence in some areas in Syria, although ISIS.
Hello, ambassadors. My name is Saira Lora, and I'm a hospitality student at FGU Vancouver campus. Now, my question is, Ambassador Wright mentioned that about 80% of the people who are now needing refuge is because of man-made problems in their countries. So, do you think that we should be working towards helping those countries and supporting them to resolve their internal problems instead?
I think one needs to, if you go back to the origins of the U.S., of the United Nations, at its creation, uppermost in everyone's mind was the conflict between nations, and this has changed now because most of these conflicts are interstate conflicts within a country, such as in Syria, but which then have international ramifications and spillover effect. And I think the UN is deployed throughout the world, also has very large peacekeeping missions with a goal to provide peace and security. It's absolutely fundamental to the foundation of the United Nations, and it's our job, and our job not so much of my agency, but of people working in the political field to try and facilitate and bring about a compromise and a political solution to conflict. I don't think the United Nations, to my knowledge, follows up in detail in the way that you're suggesting about how refugees adapt. This is more a question for their sister agency, UNHCR. In our case, let me just perhaps respond. Our Palestine refugees are in 5 different locations, and essentially this is where they ended up after the conflict in 1948-49 between Israel and Arab countries, which led to the creation of Israel, took place at the same time. So they are, we have 1.3 million refugees Palestine refugees in Gaza. There used to be 550,000 in Syria. There's now about 430,000. In Lebanon, there are about 300,000 Palestine refugees who've always been there, but they've been supplemented by 45,000 who've come from Syria. Jordan, 2.1 million Palestine refugees who've been, again, supplemented by about 16,000 who've come from Syria. Now, all these refugees, I would say, in terms of, their life opportunities, and sorry, I should say the West Bank, of course, where we have about 850,000. In terms of life opportunities, I don't think any of the refugees are living in any of our places are living lives that would be comparable to those that you are living in Canada or the US or in Europe. Some places are better than I think. To take one example, in Lebanon, a severe restraint for Palestine refugees is they're not able to work in some 40 professions which are currently closed to them, despite the fact that some legislation was passed some years ago to try and change this, but it's never been, unfortunately, implemented. And at the point when it could have been implemented, there was this huge influx of Syrian refugees from the conflict in Syria. I mean, obviously, people living in Gaza have a very, very restricted life, essentially subject to blockade and damage from the war in summer 2014 has to be undertaken, and very high unemployment, about 40%, and even higher for young people. So I think refugees, wherever they are, and I'm obviously dealing with a sort of subset, the Palestinian, are never going to be in a position where they have all the rights and opportunities that people have in states where they're permanent citizens. But it's our job to, talking from Palestinians, to make and do our best I can to give them life opportunities, human development services, education, health, etc., until hopefully a political solution to end the conflict.
But the question is totally legitimate, because the assimilation is not working as well as it should be working. And when you analyze the acts of terrorism which are taking place, you find that people who are born in the West, who are second or third generation migrants, are the ones who are conducting these terrorist acts, either because they are not fully assimilated, or because there are inadequate job opportunities, or because they have the perception that they are not getting the justice that they should be getting. So it's a major problem.
Yeah, and I think it is. I mean, but obviously the host states is, it's mainly they having accepted or invited people to come bear the primary responsibility. I'm sure that UNHCR monitors these situations very closely. I mean, the situation is a bit different for us. We're dealing with a different group of people.
I was thinking of France and recent things. Okay, over to Florum for 2 questions, and then to Metro finally. We've got 5 minutes only for 2 universities. Florum, you have the floor.
Okay, I guess I can start. My question is, what nations in Europe you're actually considering to be developed, whether it be Portugal, Greece, what have you, and how you're actually handling, how the UN is trying to handle, whether it be economically or otherwise, the Greece crisis, because Greece itself is struggling, they're bankrupt. So how are they expected to handle all this influx of people when they can't help themselves?
Okay, second question.
Are there any signs that the 5.6 or however over 5 million Palestinian refugees are there any signs that there's going to be a slowdown in that number, or are there any signs that they're going to be able to go back to their land in the near future?
Let me take the first and you take the second. On the European, Europe was based on a cement which held Europe together, and the cement was an arrangement between France and Germany. This is Adenauer and de Gaulle. And that worked very well because it was a small unit of 6 countries, 3 big, 3 small. But then they made the mistake of expanding. They were so successful that they expanded. And their first error was in allowing the British to come in, because Britain is really not a part of Europe at all. Britain believes that the English Channel is wider than the Atlantic Ocean. And so that was one error. And then Germany wanted to expand in what they call Drang nach Osten, that is to say, the magnetism of the East. So they went into Eastern Europe. And the more you expand, the more you get diluted. And so that dilution ultimately is producing the problem in which we have today, in which it is quite possible that Europe, as we know it today, European Union, may not survive the next 5 years also, because the erosion is too great. The cement is not strong enough. Over to you for the first question.
You know, I spent 33 years working for the European Union. I'm a Brit, as you can probably hear from my accent, and I've always considered myself...
You're an African, remember.
I've always considered myself a European Brit rather than a British European. But I don't agree with Ambassador Kamal. Some of you may know there will be, unfortunately, a referendum in Britain on whether to United Kingdom or whether to stay in the European Union in June. I personally think it would be an absolute disaster to leave, not only for Britain, for the if you like, the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom, because I think there would be a risk that Scotland would seek again to leave should the British people vote against staying in the European Union. But I think it would be also economically damaging, but also damaging for the cohesion of Europe. So, you know, I very much hope that Britain stays in. Now, on the second question about the 5.6 million Palestine refugees, the birth rate of the population is quite high, for example, in Gaza, about 3%. So, you know, the numbers, we anticipate that the numbers of Palestine refugees...
The birth rate is high because there's no electricity in Gaza, therefore the nights are long. And so what do you want the people to do if there's no light at night?
I'll pass on that, but I mean, so the population will grow, we estimate, to about 6.2, 6.3 million in 2020-21. And I mean, Gaza is quite an unsustainable place. And it'll be very difficult for us to cope. Look, the issue, the second question you raised about returning to the home, the original homes, is if you like, one of the highly controversial issues that are constantly discussed whenever there are peace negotiations or political negotiations between Israel and Palestine. From the Israeli standpoint, this is very, perhaps what they consider to be the most important issue. One can discuss that. What is sure is that there is a United Nations General Assembly resolution, Resolution 194, which dates from 1949, which says in paragraph 11 that refugees, Palestine refugees wishing to return should be allowed to do so, provided they do so in security and in peace, or to be compensated if they choose not to do so. Now, this famous paragraph 11 has never been implemented, so it is one of the key issues that have to be resolved in the context of a peace settlement between Israel and Palestine. And you know, we will, because there are currently no negotiations going on, I mean, it remains dormant, but it'll have to be solved because it is a legal undertaking towards Palestine refugees, and it'll have to be implemented in some form in the context of these negotiations.
Over to Metro. Sorry, we've got only a minute or two left, but over to Metro for two questions.
We actually have just one question. With global terrorism on the rise, expect countries to feel safe accepting refugees without the fear of being attacked themselves?
Great question. Terrorism and the link with it.
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert in this field, so I think, is it correct to assume that, you know, the link between refugees and terrorism is as close as you imply? You know, refugees going to whichever country are very closely screened by receiving countries, and I think I would question whether the underlying assumption of your question is correct. But what is certainly true that what Ambassador Kamal touched on earlier is that, you know, indigenous terrorism is also a question when it's not just a question of people coming in from the outside, but also people who are a second or third generation immigrants to countries in Europe, for example, who are becoming radicalized through various forms, and such as we've seen recently in Belgium and in France. So I think this is a very big question. I wouldn't like to give a clear, definitive answer, but I think I don't think one should assume that are admitted as a result of normal procedures for admitting refugees are necessarily going to be the vanguard of people who are engaged in terrorism.
I think we're running out of time. I leave it to Metro to decide whether we have time for anything else or whether you'd like to close the session from your end.
I'd like to ask a question. Going back to the start of our video conference, you referenced the Humanitarian Convention and the signatories to that. Given that so many countries are now revisiting their commitment through their actions, is it time to look at that convention again at the UN? And is this something that's being discussed?
Yeah, but that's a great question, and it is totally topical. The problem is that when you revisit these conventions, you end up with something that is worse. The devil you know is always better than the devil you don't know. And this is one of the major problems we have, because we had a structure in the world with people who were not very good people, the Saddam Husseins and the Gaddafis of the world. But we got rid of them, and look what has happened subsequently. So you have a convention which has not been fully applied, but if you broke it down, you may not get a convention which is any better at all. But that's my opinion.
Well, I agree. I think, you're talking here about a sort of body of international law, whether it's for example, the Geneva Convention on the Laws of War, which are manifestly not being applied by anybody, any side in the context of the conflict in Syria. The need, for example, in civilian settings to act proportionately, to act in a discriminatory way, to avoid civilian casualties, all these sort of things. Refugee law, which has its own rationale, and human rights law. And I think just going back to what I was saying earlier, this sort of crisis in the humanitarian system, one of the principal preoccupations of everyone is how can we do better from the situation we are in terms of applying international law, whether it's human rights law or international humanitarian law. Let me just add one element. During the conflict in Gaza, in which our agency was, of course, present there, there were 3 occasions when our United Nations buildings were hit by missiles and caused loss of life. And we also found during this conflict 3 times where we found arms components or arms components in our facilities. All these are just flagrant violations, and we have to put an end to this type of consequence. So, in answer, my short answer to your question is, what's more, if we implemented rigorously the laws of war, the laws of human rights laws, the Refugee Convention in the correct way, then the world would be a much better place, and people who are suffering from conflict would be in a better place as well. And this is the challenge. How do you do this? And how do you ensure that the existing body of law that we have will be applied properly? It may be possible at some point to improve it, but I don't think anybody believes that's the priority today. The priority is to implement what we have, which is not so bad if it's implemented, and the problem is it isn't today.
Leave it to you to close the session from your end.
Thank you so much. Mr. Wright and Ambassador Kamal, I'd like to extend our thanks for a wonderful session. I believe we found it very enlightening and learned some very important perspectives on this crisis and an understanding on the extent of the borders or limit or the lack of borders to this crisis. Once again, and our appreciation from FDU Metro Campus and all our participating locations as well.
And may I, on your behalf and on my own, thank Mr. Wright for taking the trouble to walk us through and resisting to my provocations with the bulletproof vest that he's wearing. Thank you very much. Until we meet again, goodbye from the ambassador's